Hey, my name's Elijah, and today I want to talk about your bloated WordPress site. Actually, your site might be fine, but almost everyone who creates websites with WordPress has at one point or another run into performance issues that needed to be fixed. A lot of times, these performance issues can be tied to bloat. If you're not sure what bloat is, I think of bloat as anything that's loading on a page where it's really not necessary or needed. That means anything that's loading that you actually need on the page, I wouldn't really consider bloat. Now, one of the beautiful parts of WordPress is its gigantic ecosystem of plugins. But as you'll see today, you have to be careful which plugins you install and how you use them, or else you could encounter the dreaded bloat we all aim to avoid. Just to make sure we're on the same page, I want to show you what happens when we start installing plugins on this example site I set up. By default, it's pretty lean. You can see here in the Network tab in DevTools, the site requires about 9 requests and only transfers around 90 kilobytes of data. But after activating a handful of pretty common plugins, including a photo gallery plugin, a custom fields plugin, WooCommerce, and a few others, the homepage jumps to over 90 requests and almost 700 kilobytes transferred. That's a pretty big leap. And the kicker is that we're not even really using any of those plugins on this page, which means all those extra requests, with the exception of the cart stuff from WooCommerce, which is needed for the header, fall into bloat territory. Just look at all these extra files that are being loaded on this page. I'm not sure we really need all that for the default homepage with the default theme, but the plugins we've installed think we do. So this experiment shows us just that it's easy to balloon your site's size by installing plugins. And as long as those plugins are actually doing things on the page, it's not a problem that they're loading the files. But why do some plugins load things on pages where they're not being used? Let's dive in and find out exactly why this happens and 2 ways you can fix it yourself. The first tool we have in our arsenal to combat bloat is our browser's DevTools. I'm using Chrome, but similar tools exist in other browsers and work mostly the same. First, you'll want to open up your DevTools and find the Sources tab. This is going to give you a list of everything that's loaded on the page. To find files loaded by WordPress plugins specifically, we need to dig down under the domain name into the WP-content folder and then plugins. Here on my site, I have my page builder, a split testing plugin, both loading files, which makes sense because they're in use on the page, so I wouldn't classify these as bloat. But I do see something else here that I don't think should be here. This folder is from a plugin I installed to add a code highlighting block to the block editor, which I use on some of my blog posts. There aren't any code snippets on my homepage though, so we've identified some bloat. Again, bloat is contextual. This stuff isn't bloat on my blog posts where it's actually used, but on the homepage, it's doing literally nothing except for making the page heavier. So we have this prism.js file, which is the code highlighting library that the plugin uses, and I want to see how big it is. We can do that by going into our Network tab, reloading the page, and searching for the file name. This shows us that the file is around 15 kilobytes. That's not huge, but it can add up, and it's the size of some full-featured JavaScript frameworks. There's no way we want to load an extra 15 kilobytes of dead weight on our homepage. So to find out exactly why this is loading, I want to download the plugin via SFTP and take a look at the code. If you don't have access to SFTP, you can use a file manager plugin to temporarily get access to the files and download them, but I wouldn't recommend leaving a file manager plugin active all the time. Once you have the plugin folder downloaded, go ahead and open it up in your code editor of choice. As long as it has a good search function, it'll work for what we need. To start with, I'll search for WP-enqueue script, which is the function we use in WordPress to load scripts like prism.js. Once we've located that, we can look at the function the WP-enqueue script call is within and search for that function to see how that function gets called and whether there's any logic involved to keep it from loading where it's not needed. In this case, the function is hooked to WP-enqueue scripts from within the constructor of the loose HCB scripts class, which means that as soon as that class is instantiated, the code will fire and the script will get loaded. But now we need to find out where this loose HCB scripts class is instantiated. So we can search for the class name preceded by new, and we can see it's being instantiated inside the constructor of another class. So now we need to find where that class is instantiated. So it's a little bit of investigative work to kind of work from the WP-enqueue script call backward until we find how that ends up getting called and whether there's any selective process being used to decide whether to call that. And after digging a little bit, we finally arrive at the issue. The class is being instantiated on the plugin's loaded hook, which means it's basically going to fire this code off all the time. There's no logic to check whether the scripts should be loaded. It's just loading it every time the plugin's loaded hook fires. Now, before we go writing any code to fix this, it never hurts to check if there are some configuration options in the plugin settings. In this case, I know from the code that there won't be, but it's worth checking before you start writing code snippets or installing plugins to remedy the issue. Now that we have a good understanding of the problem, we need to find a way to fix it. There are two pretty easy ways. One is by using another plugin, which I think is an okay route if you've got lots of stuff to unload on specific pages. The one I usually use is called Asset Cleanup. After installing it, you can go to your homepage or wherever you've identified bloat, and it'll give you the option to unload JavaScript and other stuff loaded by plugins on that page. There are some more complicated options as well, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. If you don't need everything that Asset Cleanup has to offer, it can be a little cleaner to do this more surgically with a custom plugin or code snippet. The way we do this is first by identifying the bloat file's handle. This is the way WordPress recognizes the JavaScript file that needs to be loaded. Once you have that, you can hook into WP-enqueue scripts and use WP-dequeue script with the file's handle as the argument to unload it. You'll have to make sure you have the right priority though, which is this little number towards the end of our code, because our dequeue script call needs to run after the file is enqueued originally, which is usually going to be priority 20 if it's not otherwise specified. Another thing to keep an eye out for is files declared as dependencies for other files. In this case, the Prism file is a dependency for this hcb-scripts file, which means even if we dequeue Prism, it'll get loaded again when the HCB script is enqueued. So probably the safest thing to do is just dequeue all of this stuff. And while we're at it, we'll dequeue the styles from the plugin as well. And to get this to finally actually work, I did have to bump the priority to 100. I probably could have used a slightly lower priority, probably anything over 20 would work, but 100 seemed like a nice clean number to use. So now it's no longer loading all this stuff on the home page, but I didn't add any logic, so it's just not going to load it anywhere, even on my blog post where I actually need it. For the finishing touch, I'll add some logic to the code snippet to check whether we're on the static homepage or not. If we are on the static homepage, we'll dequeue everything. Otherwise, it'll load as normal. And it works like a charm. This logic can be far more particular. For example, you could load it only on posts that meet specific criteria. For my purposes though, this lightens up the homepage sufficiently while still allowing the code highlighting block to work on blog posts. So now you know how to identify bloat and remove it. In some cases, this can have a really drastic impact on your site's performance. So it's always worth a look, especially when vetting new plugins. You want to make sure anything you're installing is doing just what it needs to do, where it needs to do it, and not polluting the requests and data transferred on pages where it's not even being used. If you found this helpful, make sure to leave a comment and let me know if you have any other tips or tricks that I didn't mention in this video that might be helpful to other people trying to make sure their site doesn't get bloated when installing more plugins. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.